All right, well, let's get started. And as people come in, they can just trickle in. So thank you for coming to one of these TLC, Teaching and Learning Center webinars. This one is called Redefining a Relationship with Stress, Creating a Practice that Works for You. So my name is Stephanie Simpson. We'll do a little bit about me in a minute, but the first thing I would love to, I'm going to tell you a little bit about a roadmap for today. So we're going to talk about some baselines and some intentions first. We're going to get into an intro of who I am. And we have kind of a small group, so we might be able to go around and just share who you are and how you're connected to John Jay. And then we're going to get really into what stress is. So from a holistic perspective, so biologically, physiologically, mentally, emotionally, physically, all of that. And then in between all of that, we're going to learn different practices and then think about how we can integrate it into our own lives and have some reflections. We are a small group, so feel free to ask questions throughout, and you can do that through the chat. I will keep that my eye on that, as well as unmuting and or raising your virtual hand and then unmuting. That is also okay. If it's something that I know we're going to get to, I may say, hey, can we just like put that in the fridge for a second? We'll come back to it when we can. So great. So that is a roadmap for today's session. So the first thing I would love for us to do is kind of get a baseline of where we're at right now individually. So using the chat, how stressed do you feel right now in your life on a scale of 1 to 6? So 1 being not at all stressed, 6 being very stressed. And if you find yourself, well, 6 makes sense. Okay, so we've got a 5, we got a 5, another 5. Oh, seems like we're all in the 5 range. All right, well, thank you for doing that. Now, the second thing is, where are you experiencing the most amount of stress? So knowing that all of these areas might be contributing, take a moment to reflect, where are you finding you are experiencing the most amount? So is it family, or friendships? Family, you can define any way you want. Is it career, work-related stress? Work relationships, different than like friendships, world events, and other. And if it is other, feel free to specify what that is for you. And all of the above, yes. Yes. Yeah. And so what I'm noticing from these is that all of these things can contribute to our stress in different ways. Oh, sorry to hear about that, Paul. Thank you for sharing, though, feeling safe to share with all of us. And then what I'm noticing from the different things is it's like balancing stuff, right? It's like having this intention of wanting to balance work and life, wanting to balance work and health, wanting to balance relationships. And then also, how are we doing this within the different systems we're in, right? So we ourselves are a system, which we'll talk about, and then we're a part of a system in every relationship or family that we're in. We are part of a system in our own classrooms, whether we are the teacher or the student. We are part of a system in the in our departments, which is then part of a system of John Jay, which is part of the system of Cooney. And then we can't, as much as we may want to at times, block out that we are part of a system that's even greater than that, which is where we're living and the world around us, right? So all of these things influence our lives and can be the major cause of stress. So before we get into a little bit about who I am and why me and why am I doing this, I'd love for you to take a moment to set an intention for yourself for today's session. And you can also write that in the chat. So I wrote, my intention is to share and to also hold space for the group. So I'm seeing balance and reduce the anxiety and stress to be able to get done what needs to be done in December. Yes, December 1st. Wild that we're in the last month of 2021. I was in my meditation this morning. I Zoom into this institute called Copper Beach Institute that's based out of Connecticut, and they do silent morning sits every Monday through Friday at 7:30 a.m. Welcome to anybody. So if that's something you all want to try, feel free, ask me for that information. I can send it to you. And today's facilitator was like, wow, we're getting into the last month of 2021. If I had told you in April 2020 that you would make it to December 2021, what would you be like? What would that bring up for you? And it was like, wow, yeah, that seems like, just think about where you were then and where you are now. To learn more skills to manage stress effectively, to reflect on why I tend to get stressed so easily and develop better coping mechanisms, to be open to new knowledge and safely present for others. Great. As things come up, feel free to put them in the chat. We're going to move on. So a little bit about me. As I mentioned, we're going to be looking at stress from a holistic mind, body, spirit perspective. And that is really how I try to look at my whole life and how I try to be intentional in my life. And part of that comes from the path that has led me to where I am. So I started on this journey in life as a dancer and a performer, musical theater, modern dance, jazz dance, that really did shape the decisions I made for most of my life and still does. I went to Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts for my MFA in dance performance and choreography. And I mentioned that, and it's really quite funny because I use this app called Time Hop, and I posted something on Facebook 10 years ago today that a presentation I did in my sports psychology class went really well, and then wrote possible career change. And I was thinking about that, and I was like, wow, that presentation has actually been the foundation for the work that I've continued to do for the last 10 years. I've just continued to build upon that. And so what I decided to do my thesis in for my MFA was, how do we perform optimally in high intensity situations? And at the time, really looking at dancers, because that's who I was working with, and what was happening mentally that was stopping them from physically being able to be their full and true self. And there wasn't a lot of information on this in the performing arts world, though there was an entire field called sports psychology for athletes. So I started studying sports psychology and taking the different mental training tools that they had, as well as the leadership and group development and group cohesion tools, and bringing them into the dance world, and using them specifically with my dancers, but then also in training leaders, teachers, directors, choreographers, myself, all of that. And really seeing what the mind-body connection was like. And that continued to develop as I continued to follow my own curiosities. I ended up getting hired at a private school here in New York City about 9 years ago to develop their dance and musical theater program. And while I was there, I also really got interested in coaching. Like, the sports psychology work really opened me up to, what does it mean to be a mental training coach? What does it mean to be a leadership coach? And I then went through a couple different certification programs and started building the coaching program at that school, where I am no longer a full-time teacher there, but I am their coaching consultant. So I still train faculty and staff on how to be more coach-like. I coach the faculty one-on-one, and I also work with teams, different groups, departments on campus, using a framework that I'm trained in called energy leadership. And so that also brought me to going back to another master's program at Columbia University Teachers College, where I was really looking at clinical psychology with an emphasis in spirituality, mind, body. At that point in my career, I also became a yoga certified in yoga teacher training. This was about 8 or 9 years ago as well, and started realizing, oh, it's not just mind, body, it's mind, body, spirit, or energy, however you want to name that for yourself. And the work I did there for my thesis was on stress and stress management. I started noticing in a lot of the circles that I was running in, specifically in the education world, that every conversation I was having with both students and teachers were around just how stressed out they felt. And I kept asking myself, is this really stress? Like, is everything we're saying stress, or is it something else? And as much as everybody was venting and complaining about it, it almost felt like we were trying to one up each other. And I say we because I was very much a part of this as well. And so it was like, oh, well, you got that going on. Listen to what I have going on. And then I started realizing this isn't just in the education world, in the field, it's everywhere. And, this can't be good for us. And so how can we, shift our relationship with stress, and do we want to get rid of it and all of that? And so my thesis at TC was all on how do we redefine our relationship with stress? How do we create a practice, a daily practice that helps us to understand ourselves more deeply, understand what's going around us, so that we can respond to things as opposed to react to things. And a key point to both theses is my first one, I was really looking at like fear and how fear got in the way. And fear is an element of stress as well. And I went into both of those projects thinking, how do we get rid of fear and how do we get rid of stress? And I came out of both projects going, oh, they actually are really good teachers for us. And it's about how do we learn from them and have a conversation with them and get them to work with us and for us. So that's really what we are going to dive into today. So I started teaching at John Jay about 6 weeks before the shutdown, teaching stress management. And now we're teaching one class of stress management. And now I teach all the yoga classes and the stress management, one section of stress management, as well as joining the team with Gina and others in the TLC to create this faculty and student well-being initiative, which I'm really excited to be doing, as well as having my own private coaching and consulting practice where I work with people in the tech world, in startup, in sports, in education, in arts, and finance, you name it. I have worked with them. All right, it was a little too much about me, but there we go. So let's start with a definition so that we're all kind of starting on the same page. So if we think about stress in this way, it is a physical, mental, or emotional factor that causes bodily or mental tension. So one of the things that I really love about teaching the stress management class at John Jay and the way that I teach it, I know there's many teachers that teach it and we all have our own take on it, which is great, is one of my hopes for the class is that they really start understanding their body. That definitely comes from my background in dance and somatics and movement. Having this philosophy that the body is telling us things all the time. Though we in our Western society here have really learned how to disconnect from our body. And I will give an anecdotal example right now. So my mom, few years ago, was complaining about her chest hurting. And I said to her, wow, like that sounds really scary. And she was like, yes, I don't know what it is. Like, I don't know if I pulled a muscle, blah, blah, and kept going through all these different things. I kept asking her questions. And I was like, it sounds to me, it might be stress. Stephanie, it's not stress. There's a physical pain. And I was like, I hear you. I'm not discrediting that. I'm actually acknowledging that. I do think it's stress though. She went to multiple doctors. They took x-rays. They did this, they did that. And she's like, they can't find it. I didn't break anything. I haven't strained anything. And I'm like, I really think it's stress. And she just kept telling me, no, it's a physical pain, Stephanie. Okay. And finally the doctor said to her, I think it's stress. And I was like, that's interesting, Mom. And so I just mentioned that because, we don't talk about the fact that we carry stress in our body and that there's a physical manifestation to it. And so if we're able to come back to the body, get curious about the body, that can help give us other information. And then there's mental tension, right? So, which then can cause physical tension, or the physical tension can cause mental tension because it's all connected. Stress can be an external thing. So we talked about the fact, our environment, right? So like, I know for myself, if my workspace is too cluttered, and I have my levels of clutter, right? That can create more stress. I also know that when it gets too cluttered, that's an external representation of what's happening internally for me, right? It can be a psychological and external psychological thing where the world and just like the news can be a big stressor. It can be social situations. So right now, Working with a lot of schools right now, I'm hearing that actually this year is much harder than last year. And part of it is just we haven't taken time to reflect and acknowledge and validate that just being back in person in a school setting is a lot to handle. And I don't know that places have really put in roadblocks, as I'll call them, or structures in place to help people at all the different levels of a school system to be able to navigate that. And then it can also be internal, right? So we'll talk about how actually physical stress in the body can turn into illness. We can get sick and then that can create stress, right? We may get hurt or need a medical procedure and that can create stress. And what we're going to look at in terms of the process of stress is that there is some sort of perceived threat, and you'll hear me say perceived over and over and over again, because we can change what we think is threatening. Also, what we think is threatening changes based on our day, right? So if I know myself that if I don't sleep a certain amount, the next day, the things that I perceive as threatening are going to be a lot more than the things when I'm feeling really rested. When we are sick, and not very clear-headed, we perceive things as more threatening than we do when we are more healthy and feel open-minded. So we have this perceived threat, that is the stressor. And that sounds literally an alarm into our brain. And we'll talk about that in more detail soon, which then releases a system in the body, right? And so then we have the stress reactivity, that's that process. And we'll talk about how that shows up. And then there's the strain or the outcome. And we'll talk about some examples of that. So that's the framework we're using today. So what happens when we have this perceived threat? Okay, so we have what's called the fight, flight, and freeze. A few people in the world are now talking about fawn. I'm not going to really get into that because I haven't done a deep dive on it yet. So we're going to stay with fight, flight, and freeze. So what happens in the brain, right, is that we have this perceived threat, this stressor, and all of a sudden the amygdala literally flips. Like when we say we flip our lid, right, the amygdala flips and sounds the alarm, and it triggers the hypothalamus, which then triggers the autonomic nervous system, which controls our basic bodily processes, such as our hormone balance, our temperature, the constriction and dilation of blood vessels. It releases our catabolic hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. We have different reactions called like sweaty palms or hotness, or maybe we get a little shaky. And it's releasing these hormones so that it can strip down. These catabolic hormones are there to strip down every system so that the only thing we can do and focus on is getting to safety. And then we decide, does that mean I need to fight this stressor, this threat that I see? Does it mean I need to run and fly away? Or does it mean I need to freeze, right? And so we then determine in those moments what we need to do. Now, the problem is if we don't fully release this system, right? If we don't fully process that and allow the catabolic hormones, the adrenaline, the cortisol to release out of our system, we then are continuously are on high alert, and that begins to weaken our immune system. And now we are more susceptible to getting sick. And then if we have an illness, that can then become prolonged and it can turn into disease. And that can have some serious long-term effects. It also can lead to burnout, right? So stress doesn't have to lead to burnout, though it is one of the major causes of burnout. And when we look at burnout from a holistic perspective, it's not just a physical thing. It's a mental fatigue. It's an emotional fatigue. People tend to become disengaged in all areas of their lives. They tend to kind of collapse and retreat into themselves. There's a lack of purpose. There's a lack of motivation. There tends to be a lot of lethargy and just feelings of feeling stuck, right? And before coronavirus came around, the pandemic came around, the World Health Organization had flagged burnout as one of the major epidemics of the United States, and that just has increased over the last year and a half, almost 2 years. So we're gonna learn how to shift how to shift our perceptions on stress and how to redefine those pathways, right? Because we have specific pathways that we have been embedded in us right now. And so we do have the power to shift those pathways and create new ones. I see there's a question. Can that also, oh, Amber, what a great setup, because what we're going to turn to next. So Amber's question in the chat is, can that also lead to anxiety as well, like being overly stressed? So let's talk about the differences between things. And one of the things that we talk about in the stress management class, and what the book, the author, I forget his name, but what he talks about is creating these roadblocks. Like if we think about our life, and I always vision that game, and maybe some of us might not know this game, but the game of life, literally the board game, and you're in that car and you're going around and you're adding on different things, right? And then you get one card where you have a really good job and you're like, yes. And then you get another one where you lose all your money, that whole thing, right? Makes me want to play that game again. I need to know where it is. Is that not everything leads to stress? If we can create these little roadblocks on the way of life, we can take a different turn, we can pause, and we can stop ourselves from getting to that stressed out place. So if we work backwards, if we look at stress, we've already defined stress as that perceived inability to meet demands, right? That perceived threat. And it's really like, oh, all of this is going on and I don't have the resources. I'm never going to get to everything. So it's our perceived inability to be able to do what it is that we're being asked to do. So if that's where we start and we work backwards, worry leads to stress. And worry is this repetitive, reoccurring thoughts, right? So having that same thought over and over again of like, I'm going to take Paul, his intention of like, how can I get everything done in December, right? So knowing that the semester ends on like the 14th or the 15th or whatever, whenever exams are. And then like we have to do all the grading as teachers to be able to turn around and like hand in grades. As students, you probably have like a gazillion assignments that you need to do by the end, all of that, right? So if we continue in our thoughts to be like, oh my God, I'm never going to get this done, or how am I going to get this all done, or oh my God, I have so much going on, blah, blah, blah. That worry, that repetitive thought over and over and over again can lead to stress. And I think of worry as like a rocking chair. As much as rocking chairs can be really soothing, worrying is like going back and forth on that rocking chair. It's not really moving you forward. You're just staying in the same place, going back and forth, right? And then we have fear and anxiety that lead to worry, and not one more than the other. They're both kind of related. We look at fear as this untaught instinctive reaction. So we do need a certain level of fear, right? Like there's a reason why we need to try things and then it not work out and like protect us from doing other things, right? So I always think of that example of not putting your hand on a burning stove, right? Like as a kid, you might be curious and be like, oh, whatever. And then you get hurt and you're like, oh, I like, don't do that again, right? Like I'm afraid of getting burned. And that physical thing is really necessary. However, there are many other things that we end up being afraid of that aren't that are more of a story we're telling ourselves, not that physical thing that we just thought, oh, we got burned, right? And so it may be like the fear of failure, right? A lot of times when I'm coaching people and we get to like the root of everything, it's always, well, I'm afraid I'm going to fail. And my next question will be like, and so what if you do fail? What does that mean to you? And I'll hear things like, well, then I'm proving to people that I'm not enough. I'm like, well, who said you're not enough? Right. And so these stories and stuff is that fear of like, I just had a call this morning of someone saying, like, why don't people bet on themselves? Like, why don't they take those risks and bet on themselves? And it's usually some sort of fear, right? Fear of failure, fear of making a mistake, fear of not being good enough, fear of not living up to some expectation. And so where coaching and self-reflection can really come in handy and be a really big impact is whose expectations, who's setting up this narrative for you, and what do you want to choose to do, right? So anxiety are these excessive fears and that aren't really based in a lot of truth. Now, anxiety, I will state here, like, I'm not discrediting that there are, I will say myself, there was a time I was on anti-anxiety meds, right? Like, there are definitely diagnoses here. I am not a mental health practitioner, so I'm not going to go into that realm. Though the idea of anxiousness, anxiety is usually based in some sort of fear that is unfounded. And I think the first thing that we are going to talk about, a first skill we're going to have is going to be around anxiety, of where is this irrational belief coming in, right? So, and there's different types of anxiety. We can have test anxiety, or state anxiety, or social anxiety, or phobias, right? Come up in anxiety, and usually it's some unwarranted irrational belief that's the basis of it that's causing this anxiety. And so being able to get clear on what that is, and then slowly creating different steps and practices to help alleviate that irrational belief. I'm going to pause there. Do we have any questions on these distinctions? No? All right. Well, here we go. Moving on. Oh, yes. Not so far. So, okay, great. So tool number 1 is called the ABCDE technique. And this tool is actually, it was created by a psychologist named Albert Ellis. And he theorized that anxiety is a function of irrational beliefs, like I was just saying. And that we learned earlier that anxiety, as we learned earlier that anxiety can lead to stress, he says that we believe that we must be adequate and thoroughly competent in achieving. And if we're not that way, then we won't be able to get the love and the approval from others that we're looking for and looking outward, right? And so when we don't get that, we then believe that we're not loved, we're not good enough, we're not whole. And that sometimes when things don't go as we want it to be, we then end up catastrophizing it. So he came up with this technique. So the first thing to think about is, and you can do this as I lead you through, is think of something that has been coming up that's been in your mind giving you anxiety. And first take a moment to identify this activating agent, right? So identifying the stressor, that's A. Then we want to identify the belief system. So if you look over here, what facts are there, if any, to support this belief? So you're identifying the different beliefs you have around this stressor, right? So maybe as students, there's exams coming up and the anxiety is around taking tests and being like, I need to get A's on anything. I'm not going to get an A on everything. And if I don't get an A on everything, then like, I'm not going to get, my transcript's not going to look a certain way. And then I'm not going to get into the grad program I want to get into. And if I don't do that, I'm going to look like a failure. And, you know, I'm the only one in my family to go to college. And so like, there's a lot of pressure and all this sort of stuff, right? So maybe these are some of the beliefs. So what facts are there, if any, to support this belief? So you go through and you kind of think about yourself as like a researcher and observe these beliefs. Like, okay, so what fact is there that I won't get an A? Well, there isn't any. I haven't taken the test yet, right? What fact is there that if I don't get all A's, I'm not going to get into a grad program? Well, no one has told me that, right? And so you go and you start disproving these, and then you can kind of create, is it rational or irrational, right? So maybe there is a rational thought in there. Maybe there was some sort of comment made at a family event where it's like, well, you have to do well because you're the first person in our family to go to college. Okay, so maybe that is a belief that someone else has. Then you can start thinking, okay, but that's their belief. Is that my belief? How does that align with me? Letter C is about consequences. So what are the mental, physical, behavioral, spiritual, psychological consequences of continuing to believe what it is you're believing, right? So in that case, well, if I continue to believe this way, I'm probably going to not sleep very well, which means that when I do wake up to take this test, I'm not going to feel my best self. I'm not going to be able to concentrate on what's going on, whether studying or taking the test, because I'm so in my head. And then I'm not going to get the grade that I want, which is what I'm going to prove to myself that I really couldn't do what I need to do. Right. And then D, disputing the irrational beliefs. So that's a little bit of what I talked about before. And then E is effect. So how can you create a change? What can you do? Even one little thing can you do that will change the consequences? So maybe it's, okay, I need to take a break. I need to do a breathing exercise, or I need to go for a walk, or I need to set up a schedule, or I need to create affirmations that allow me to come back to having a focused mind and not letting my mind go all over the place. And so this just kind of helps you to get out of the panic mode that anxiety can kind of create and bring us back into the real moment. And what can you do now from this place of being in the present? Amber, I appreciate you sharing that. Yes, you are not alone in that. And there is, I never quote this correctly, but Adam Grant just posted a couple of weeks ago about imposter syndrome, which the more and more I coach people of varying ages and backgrounds and fields and industries and levels in the industries that they're in, no one ever fully gets rid of imposter syndrome. And he was talking about the fact that like imposter syndrome is this weird thing where we don't believe others who think that we are good at something, but we don't believe that we're good at the thing. And yet we believe ourselves more than we believe the others. And I really butchered that. So please go on Instagram or LinkedIn and find it, because it's really good. And if I have time at the end, I'll find it for everybody. But it was like, oh yeah, like how come even when we hear and see that we're doing well, do we still not believe it, right? And that's where the inner work is really important to create more like satisfaction in our lives. So let's talk about what we mean by a stress management practice. Like this whole thing is about, redefining your stress, your relationship with stress, creating a practice that works for you. So one of the things I realized in my research at Columbia was that as I did so many customer interviews and market research things, and for people in the workplace, I was really interested of what the workplace was doing for their employees. And it wasn't much, to be honest. And there were things like, well, we get a monthly allowance to go to like the gym. Okay, well, that's helpful. How many times are you going to the gym? Not many, because I'm working so many hours. Or, oh, well, occasionally they have like yoga at lunch. Okay, so then when do you eat lunch? Well, I don't on those days. Okay. So thinking about how can we create a comprehensive stress management practice, meaning how are we looking at the source of the stress and managing that? How are we being thoughtful in preventing stressors and avoiding them? How are we integrating relaxation techniques, not just at lunch when we're taking a yoga class? And how are we managing our thoughts and reframing things? And how are we doing these in the moment? Because if we're only doing them during lunch or only the times that we get to go to the gym, I mean, I don't know about you, but like when I'm feeling stressed out in a meeting, I can't be like, hey, can we pause for a second? I'm going to do a yoga flow before I can come back to this meeting, right? Like that's just not we're not capable. That's not an option for us, right? And so I started thinking, how do we create, programs and systems that allow people to do things in and out of the workplace, do it while they're maybe in a meeting with somebody, or while they're listening to a client, or while they're teaching, that helps set them up for success as they go forward. And also that what works for me today may not work for me tomorrow. What works for me may never work for you. So, how can we have a multitude of practices in our tool belt? And so that's really what kind of like drove what I ended up creating in my thesis. And I don't really get into it today because it's, but I created this workbook that gives you 21 different tools from a very holistic perspective. And it's really important to know that the purpose of creating an effective stress management practice is not to eliminate all stress, because we actually need a certain amount of stress in order to perform optimally, to have that peak performance state. And so it's about finding your sweet spot of stress. It's really about how are we redefining our relationship with stress. When we avoid it, we're going to make things worse, right? So how can we do that? Question was, would planning under prevention be working to become more organized? Yes. So that is a great example of planning under prevention. So let's talk about these quickly. So source management, we kind of did a beginning of this in that little poll at the beginning. Where are you finding the most stress, right? So there are certain things that we can eliminate, right? I always bring up this example. In my previous workplace, there was a specific colleague who we just did not have a great relationship, right? And so I knew that I couldn't eliminate them from the school, but I could choose where I sat for lunch. I could choose to not go into the building that he worked in. I could choose to do things like that, which then limited or at least reduced the amount of stress that was triggered in me whenever I had to interact with him. And then when I knew that I had to interact with him, I could use some of my other tools to make it so that it was a healthy interaction for myself. Something that actually work from home did for many people, that maybe just shifted stress in different ways, but commuting has it was a very big stressor for many people, whether that's in a car because of traffic or on the train, and could add a lot of time to people's workday. And so not being able to go into the office or into the school or campus and working from home eliminated that source of stress. Now, did it create other stresses? Probably, but it eliminated that source of stress. So as programs or as companies are figuring out what work looks like now, being able to create these hybrid schedules where sometimes you're in the office, sometimes you're not, is actually reducing a lot of the stress that many people have had, because they don't have to have those 2-hour commutes, 1 hour each way. Let's skip to prevention. So prevention, yes. Knowing that, so as educators who are on the call, I always think about this myself, and when I coach teachers, I do the same thing with them, is that we actually have a lot of agency on how we want things to go in our semester, right? Yes, there's content that we need to get out there, and there are these, deadlines that we need to meet in certain ways. Though we do have a lot of flexibility, I believe, at least I feel like I do, of when things are assigned and when they are due. And you can look at your semester and be like, you know what? I have a wedding that weekend. I'm going to make sure that no major assignment comes in on that weekend, right? Or, oh, wow, okay, this is happening over here. So maybe I, switch this project with that or this unit over here, because it will line up a little better in the flow of me being able to get papers in and how I'm going to correct them, right? So like I always have the stress management class does this stress management workbook I mentioned that I created, and a reflection paper that is always due like way before the end of the semester, because then I know that at the end of the semester I'm getting reflection papers from all my yoga students, right? And so then I make sure that for my own health and sanity, that I am able to get through the stress management papers and workbooks before even the yoga ones come in, right? And so like that's a little bit about planning and keeping organized and all of that. And you can do that in a macro level, and then also like weekly or monthly, and then weekly, and then every day, right? So one of my clients, I love this visual. She works in talent acquisition, and she was like, well, I use this system where what are rubber balls and what are glass balls? Rubber balls, I can drop and they'll keep bouncing until I'm ready to pick it up, or I can bounce it to someone else. A glass ball, if it drops though, it's going to shatter, right? So being like, okay, today is Wednesday, I have X, Y, and Z to do. What's rubber, what's glass? And that might help to prioritize some things. And then in the moment, so those are a little more like macro to micro. In the moment, we have thought management techniques, which we just did one. I will do another one later. We have relaxation techniques, whether that's breath work or meditation or visualization or walking or progressive relaxation or things of that nature that can also help us. And it's super important to remember, and I'll mention this at the end, that these aren't things to just do in the stress state. We need to practice these when we're not in the stress state so that our body, mind, spirit know what they are and goes, oh, I have a tool. And that comes to the surface before what our ingrained subconscious, unconscious habits come to the surface. It's about making that space so we can respond and not react. Which leads into this slide of when we can create a new perspective, we then create a new pathway, right? So taking that moment before reacting allows for our hippocampus to remind us of past experiences where we were safe, we got through it, right? So we all have made it through semesters, and we've made it through some very hard semesters in the last 2 years, right? And we did it, right? So reminding ourselves that we've done it before can give us the confidence to reduce our fear, to be like, I can do it again, right? And so that allows the cerebral cortex to understand the situation in a new way, right? And create a new pathway as a response. And as we continue to build these new pathways and practice these new pathways, we create literally new matter in our brain, which then creates resilience. So when we think about resilience is about how, when we get knocked off our balance, how quickly do we recover and get back to balance? And depending on the stressor, that's also going to play a part. But it's okay to get knocked down. It's how do we use these tools to get us to come back to that place of balance? And I always think that it's not just like a point. It's kind of like this like top of a sphere, right? If we can just hover here, then we're okay. When we start hovering to the side, we know maybe we're like, okay, we gotta implement some new things to get us back up to here. But then when we get back to the bottom, right, that's maybe where we're like, okay, what can I do to help shift myself up this sphere? Yes, Albert, great question. So reacting implies intent, but what about things that trigger us so we don't get to that? I assume like, so we don't get to that moment. So here's where practicing these things when you're not in the stress reaction is super important, right? Because so when people talk about like a meditation practice, a daily meditation practice, and committing to that, it's about getting what's actually happening in meditation is you are realigning your autonomic nervous system. You're taking it from the sympathetic, which is outward, right, when it gets triggered by the stress response, and you're turning it the other way to the parasympathetic, which is about restoring and relaxing and rejuvenating. And so when you're practicing meditation or breath practices on a daily basis, even when you're not feeling overwhelmed and stressed, you are showing your body that that is an option. And then it becomes creating these other types of triggers for yourself, right? So when something happens and triggers a response, a reaction you don't like, being able to like stop in that moment and be like, wait a second, that's not how I want to be, right? And so what I try to teach people is getting back to your body. Like, what am I feeling in my body right now? What is my body telling me? How can I get into my grounded place, right? When we react to something right away, that is something in us that's not been healed and processed. And the more that we can create space in between what happens and what we do, the more choice we have and the more power we have. I hope that helped a little bit. You can let me know if it didn't. Okay, great. So let's try another tool here. So square breathing, one of my favorites. And actually, you can do square breathing in a couple ways. I'm going to teach you today in a way that combines the actual breath practice with also a visualization part to it. So we're going to inhale through the nose. You can exhale through the mouth or the nose, up to you. We're going to inhale on a 4 count. And if you want to add the visualization to it, you're going to imagine in your mind's eye that your breath is drawing a line upward. Then we're going to pause at the top of our breath for 4 and imagine that line coming across. And then we're going to exhale for 4, imagine the line coming down. And then we're going to pause at the bottom and imagine that line going across the other way to complete the square. So we're going to do this 3 times. 2 of the times I will lead you through the counting, and the 3rd time you'll do on your own. If it's accessible and feels okay to you, you can close your eyes. If not, you can just kind of take a soft gaze, maybe drop the chin a little bit. And we'll begin by inhaling through the nose on a 1, 2, 3, 4, and pause. 2, 3, 4, and exhale. 2, 3, 4, and pause. 2, 3, 4. Again, inhale, visualizing the line going up. 2, 3, 4, and pause. The line goes across. 2, 3, 4, and exhale. The line goes down. 2, 3, 4, and pause. The line completes the square. 2, 3, 4. Taking one more round on your own time. And when you're ready, coming back to the space we're in, opening your eyes if they were closed. And so one of the things I love about this breath is if you're feeling like physically your body is really like charged, you're breathing, you're focusing on your breath. It's changing the physiology in your body. If your mind is racing, that visualization is giving you an anchor point, right? So when we are feeling anxious, when we're feeling depressed, worried, all of that, it's either because we're projecting too far in the future or we're ruminating too much in the past and we're not in the moment, right? And so it's really about bringing ourselves back to the moment, because that's the only control we have, right? So if we really think about what's bringing things up is we feel like we're not in control at times. We can only control the moment that we're in and how we're showing up in that moment, right? And so finding different ways to anchor us back into the moment. This was 2 different ways. 1, the breath. 2, the visualization. Any questions here before we move on? Great. So I mentioned earlier that we don't want to get rid of stress completely. I also find it really fascinating that at the beginning of each semester in my stress management class, I have them kind of talk about their relationship with stress and how they feel they are. And about half of them will say, I don't really feel stressed. Like, I don't really have it. Like, I'm pretty good at managing it. And it's usually that same group that by the end realizes that what they were actually doing was just avoiding it and disconnecting from their body. Because throughout the semester, I have them do these different reflections, these different activities that they take little assessments on, like emotional intelligence, on different habits they have, and they start realizing, oh, I didn't even realize that some of these things were stress. And so we don't want to we don't want to eliminate it, right? And so we can categorize things though as things called eustress, which is good stress, and distress, which is the bad stress, right? Sometimes a distress can actually shift to a good stress, a eustress, based on our thoughts and the way that we are talking about it to ourselves. An example of that would be when you talk to some cancer patients. Obviously, being diagnosed with cancer is an incredibly distressful situation for the person and the family members and anybody in their lives. And many times, cancer patients can say that it also was the thing that shifted the way that they looked at their life and the world around them. And all of a sudden, they started making changes in which they started doing the things that they wanted to do and living the life that they wanted to live, right? And so that doesn't devalue the fact that cancer is a terrible thing and that they're continuously managing that and dealing with that. They're not acknowledging and validating that. They are also, though, acknowledging and validating that because of that, it led to something maybe even better in their life. I wouldn't say even better, a new way of looking at their lives, which could be looked at in a more positive, facilitating way. Some other examples, and what might be considered a eustress situation for me may not be for someone else, right? So an example may be, let's talk about what happened to a lot of people in COVID, losing their job, right? Or getting furloughed. That's a stressful thing. That's a big change. For some people, it might have been the exact thing that they needed and wanted. And so it became a good stress because they're like, great, now I have the time and the space to create the business I've always wanted to do. For others, it could have become very distressful where it's like, well, now how do I feed my family, right? So that same incident can be different for two different people. So thinking about like how you can use this in your own life is, as things come up, how do we look at them in a way of is this a good stress or is it a bad stress? If it's a bad stress, how can I try to reduce or eliminate it? Or how can I reframe it to make it a good stress? So when I was doing my master's at TC, I was also working full time. I was also coaching part time. I had a lot going on. And this will come into one of the next tools we have about reframing, is I kept being like, oh my God, I'm so overwhelmed. I have all this reading to do. And then I have this paper, but then I'm like directing the show and then I have to teach and then blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm so stressed out. I'm so overwhelmed. And I stopped and I said to myself, well, you're the one that chose to go back to grad school. Like literally no one forced you to do that. You chose to do that. And you did it because you were curious about things and you were excited to be back in the classroom. You also wanted to, it's going to propel your career forward. It's giving you the time and the space to be able to think about all these things you've been thinking about on your own and get feedback and have thought partners and all of that. And so it redefined to me that like, oh, this is a good stress. This is like having to read these things, which then I shifted things and I go, oh, I don't have to do this. I get to do this. That one little shift from I have to I get to changed the way that I approached everything I was doing in that program. So that's another, and that'll come up in the reframing, which is coming up soon, right? So I mentioned earlier, finding your sweet spot, right? So when we are not challenged enough, right? And we don't have stress, also has that feeling of pressure, of constriction, right? When we don't have a little bit of that pressure and constriction, we just get bored, right? So I'm sure you can think of a time where, maybe you're at a job or you're in a class that's just not really challenging to you or interesting to you. And so you just disengage because you're bored. And so your performance level is down here. The same as it would be if you had too much going on and you were in a class that was too overwhelming for you and maybe too challenging for you, right? As we start building that challenge, right? As we start building some of the stuff, we start getting excited and that excitement, when we think about sensations, the sensation of excitement and fear are actually the same sensation in the body. We get to choose whether we want it to be fear or excitement. And I would even go further to say, like, you get to choose for it to be both. And you can write the story that, like, you can be nervous and maybe fearful that something won't happen and really excited that you get to do all these things, right? And then it's about how do you navigate all of that to then get to that place of that peak performance, which is I have that like enough tension to keep me excited and on my toes, but I don't feel overwhelmed. I don't feel like I don't have the tools. I'm not in my head feeling like, oh my gosh, no one's going to believe me. I'm an imposter, or I'm going to fail. And if I fail, then I'm going to be homeless, or whatever might downward spiral, right? When we have too much and there's too much pressure, then we get to this other side where we get burnt out. So, this also reminds me, it's a similar bell curve to Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's flow theory, around the fact that like we need that balance between ability and skill and challenge. And if that's not both, if it's not going like this, we'll never get to that flow state. So here's the third tool I was talking about, reframing it, right? And I love this quote: I see a light in the darkness, because there cannot be light if there is not darkness, and there cannot be darkness if there's not light, right? And so it's just what we're choosing to see and how we're seeing it. So that example before of, I get to do these readings, I get to do this project, I get to do this thesis, shifts and creates, and it made a difference. How do I want to say this? It became more of like a privilege for me, right? As opposed to, this is just a right, because it wasn't, and it's not, right? So, earlier in the call, we were talking about like these moments of when things aren't going the way that we're going, right? Like, or the way that we want it to go. We can choose to reframe that and say, what am I learning from this? What is this teaching me, right? In the framework I'm trained in, energy leadership, it's a very level 5 perspective to take, where it's like, okay, so we just tried this. Here's the information we got. Didn't fail. There's not a problem. There's not a challenge. What are the different solutions, and how can we just take the feedback from all these different things we're trying and use it to continue to guide us, right? So thinking about in that more open way. And the more that we can release the stress hormones and cycles, we're no longer in those like tunnel vision. We're able to open the vision into this wider view and see that there's so many different opportunities. There's so many different ways that we can go about what we're doing, because we're actually then tapping into our anabolic hormones, which allow us to tap into creativity, our intuition, remind ourselves that we know what we're doing and we can do it and we've done it before. And so building our confidence. Checking the time. All right. So tool number 4. So we've done a couple of mental tools. We've done a breath tool, which relaxation. This is another relaxation one, but also a physical one. And progressive relaxation. So one of the, when we talk about strains, right? So the outcomes of things, many times, so the example of my mom, right? The strain that she was having, the outcome she was having was that physical pain in her chest, right? And when we don't notice what's happening in our body, a lot of times that's where the strain happens, right? We get a headache, we have backaches, shoulders, all of that. A lot of times it's because we're doing this thing called bracing, which is holding unnecessary tension in the body, which is usually because we're tightening something because we're nervous or we're scared or we're anxious or we're overwhelmed, right? Also, other strains can be the idea of burnout, right? So like maybe sleeping too much and never feeling energetic. It could be lashing out at somebody because we're overwhelmed and all of a sudden it just comes out, right? That's a strain. That's an outcome. So progressive relaxation, we're going to do together right now. And what this is, and when you're practicing this, you should always be sitting down or lying down. Don't do it standing, and you'll see why as we go through. Is we're going to go through the body, almost like a body scan, and we're going to tense different muscle groups and then release them, and then tense another muscle group and release them. And we're going to go from top to bottom and then bottom to top. And I will guide you through this right now. So we're going to start with our face and our head and scrunching it up as much as you possibly can. And then release. And then we're going to scrunch our neck and our shoulders and release. And then our arms and our fists, maybe to a point that they're shaking, and release. And then our whole center of our body, our core, our back, our lower back, our stomach, everything, and release. Down to our glutes and our low belly, and release. And then we'll do our upper legs, our quads and our hamstrings, and release. And then we'll do our calves into our feet and our toes, and release. Take a moment to just notice how your body feels right now before we do it again, going from bottom to top. So now we'll start with the bottom, squeezing those toes and the feet and the calves, and release. And squeezing the upper legs, and release. The low belly and the hips and the glutes, and release. The center and core of our body, our chest, our right above the belly button, our back, and release. Our arms and our fists, maybe getting a little into the shoulders, and release. Now going into the shoulders and the neck, and release. Back to the face and the head, and release. And taking a nice deep breath here, just noticing the body as you've done that. So what you're doing there too is if your mind is the thing that's going off, right, is you're giving it an anchor point again, right, the different body parts, and then physically contracting the muscles, right, and then letting it release, is you're allowing those hormones and the different the catabolic hormones to like leave the body, right, to leave that area. It may also, you might have indicated some places in the body where you're like, oh, didn't realize I had so much tension in the shoulders. Or once I released my low belly, wow, I really hold a lot of tension in my low belly, right? So it's giving you more information about where you might be holding your own stress in your body. It's also a great thing to do before bed. If you're one of the people like me, where as soon as you get into bed and you've been tired for like the last 4 hours, but then you get into bed and you can't go to sleep because your mind is racing, this is a great technique to do because it's giving your mind something to do and it's relaxing your body. And so it's actually putting you in that like in between state before you drift off into sleep. And there are, I use something called Insight Timer a lot, which is a free app you can get. And there are people who like guide you through this, or like a yoga nidra or things like that, in a body scan that are intended for you to drift off into sleep. So great tool for then. And the last tool we're going to talk about today is how do we tap into our creative side? So in this workbook that I created, there's 7 different categories. You have breath, you have body, you have mind, you have values, perspective, creativity, and visualization. And so if you are interested in learning more about that, send me an email and I can tell you a little more about it. But part of it is tapping into our creative side, right? When we can tap into our creative side, we end up being able to problem solve more easily. We can see different solutions, and it's a fun thing to do. And so creativity can be defined in many different ways. So one of my favorite things to do is have like a little solo dance party. And if you're working from home, you just take a moment, put on your favorite song and just dance around. And so you're physically doing something, but you're also getting those creative juices going. This is a mandala practice. And so, there's many books, like adult coding books you can get. You can print one offline. But just the act of like coloring in and making your own choices, and you can have music going on, whatever it is, allows you to relax as well as tap into this creative side of yourself. And when you think about, they've done now studies on rest, right? And that rest isn't just like a physical thing like sleeping. We have actually different types of rest. And one of them is creative rest, mental rest, spiritual rest, all of that. And it's been proven that when we take these moments of rest, we can then come back to what it was we were doing in a more restorative way, and sometimes in a way that we see things in a new way, in a new light, right? So, and creativity can also look like creating a meal, right? Like I'm not a big cook, but some people love that, right? Or I love decorating my house. So like I did that the other day when I came back from Thanksgiving, and like that's a creative thing. Like where am I going to put things? All of that. So you can define creativity also in what best resonates with you. So I mentioned this before, is the power of practice and also just paying attention, right? So I've said several times that it's the how we start shifting this in our lives. Change takes a while, and behavior change takes a while. And the only way that we can do it is by being intentional and persistent in our practicing, right? And consistent, right? So creating these practices for yourself, trying things, whether that's like going, every morning I'm going to wake up and I'm going to breathe for 5 minutes before I do anything else. Even 5 minutes will change, right? And committing to that practice. And so Richard Strozzi Heckler, he founded the Strozzi Institute, and he is the author of the book, The Leadership Dojo. And he talks about some somatic embodied leadership. And so it's, it is a mental thing, but it's also a physical thing. It's a somatic thing. It's an emotional thing. And we can enter this in different ways. We can think about, what am I feeling emotionally, or what am I feeling in my body? What physically, what am I doing? What is my behavior? What's my mind doing? And just making these slight little shifts and being committed to doing that on a daily basis will lead to change down the line. And when we talk about being conscious or aware, it's about bringing ourselves back to that present moment and consistently doing that, right? Consistently going, oh, wait, I'm off in a different world. Let's come back to the moment. Let's be mindful of the moment. What can I do now? And what do I want to do now? And that's living a very conscious, intentional life, as opposed to just doing what you've always done and what you've just learned from the outside. So these are two quotes that I think are really powerful. So let's take a moment. That was a lot, and we have about 5 minutes left. I'd love for you to think about 1 to 2 insights you had today. And then once you've thought about that, think about how you might integrate some of these insights, right? So what is like a new insight you had, and go, okay, how do I want to integrate this into my life? Like, what is a step, no matter how small it is, that I can commit to, and think about what that step looks like, be specific about it, give yourself a time frame, and then think about the idea of like, what support do you need for this, right? When we're creating change in our own life, that's going to shift other people too. So what support do we need? Do we need to tell other people, right? Do we need to create a boundary? And so therefore we need to talk to some other people about this boundary we're creating, because they're part of it too, and what does it mean to be accountable for this? What does that look like? I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that I can see everybody. But again, just thinking about 1 to 2 insights you had today, and then taking one of those insights and creating some sort of action step and plan to how to integrate this into your life going forward. And before we leave, I would love if you feel comfortable to either unmute and share your insight, and maybe you don't have to share the whole action plan, but share an insight that you had, a question you had, or anything like that, or you can write it in the chat, and we'll just close with a couple of people sharing out. Yeah, Veroni.
So one of the insights that I had, and I've heard this before, is that stress and excitement are triggered by the same chemical. So something that I am going to try and reframe my thinking is, maybe I'm not stressed about this, maybe I'm excited about this, and I am just in maybe a negative mindset, and I'm interpreting this reaction as a stressful reaction, and instead I'm actually excited and ready for this challenge, and ready to take whatever is going to happen. So I'm going to try and be more positive about that.
I love that. Yeah. And I would say that it's the excitement and the fear that come up, right? Which then could lead to stress, right? And that it doesn't have to be one or the other. It can be both, right? Like, so, like example, when I got hired to teach the stress management class, it was like a few weeks before the semester started, and I was directing a show, and I was teaching full time, and I was doing all this other stuff. And I was super excited for it. And I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. Right. And that's not true. Right. Like, I did know what I was doing, but that was what the thought that came up was like, oh crap, I don't know, I can't do this. How am I going to do this? I don't know anything. Blah, blah. And of course that's not true. And I was also like, and I'm so excited to be able to do this, right? So both things can be equally true, and acknowledging and validating that within ourselves actually creates that roadblock before it becomes stressful, right? Because then I could ask myself, okay, where's the fear coming from? Oh, the fear is coming from the fact that like, I don't think that I'm gonna have enough time to get all this together. Okay, so how can I create systems to be able to do that? What time do I need to block off? What do I have to say no to now, right? Another fear for mine was like, what if I don't know everything that the students are asking me? Okay, do you ever know everything the students are asking you in any content area? No. So how do you handle it when in dance someone asks you something? You went, that's a good question. Let's learn that together, right? Like, let's look at that together, right? So, being able to then stop and actually coach myself on it was really helpful. I'm seeing something in the chat. I need to reflect on what stresses me out and why. Yes. How I can take the time to figure out what is real. Love that. And irrational versus irrational, and how to reframe the situation to have more control over my reaction to it. Love that. Thank you, Albert, for sharing that. Anyone else want to share?
Yeah, I wanted to share something real quickly. I think listening to the presentation and following some of the comments kind of challenged me to think about the generational trauma that really kind of establishes a lot of how we think and how we react. So if you're a first generation, or if you're an immigrant or from a refugee family, then there are traumas that pressure you. And sometimes there are good pressures where like the pressure to go to college, we could say, is maybe a good pressure, even though college is not for everyone. But it does kind of like direct you in some kind of direction in life. And so, but I think when that trauma defines a lot of your behaviors, a lot of your responses, just like the example of sitting in a train, and the smallest thing can really stress you out, is that like we do see a connection between life expectancy and stress. And when you incorporate class and race and all these other aspects, that like this is a life and death situation. Like stress can kill you. And so I appreciate all the training that you brought in, and it helped me kind of reflect about the generational element.
Mohammed, I really appreciate you naming that and bringing that into this space, because that is very true. And it's actually the chapter we just discussed in class last week was diversity and stress and occupational and stress. And the statistics out there are really quite horrifying. And it is a life or death thing. And I would say that it's really important for all of us in depending on our background, is how do we get back to our own self, in the sense of like, for me right now, a lot of the work that I'm doing for my own healing journey is how do I re-regulate my nervous system, right? And like that's where like the generational stuff comes in, and that's where the breathing and the meditation and all of that, so that I'm recalibrating that system, so that I can take a moment to stop and say, what is mine and what was given to me, if that makes sense. And then that gives me the power to choose what I want to do. Now, that's not always easy, right? Like it's not, I'm not saying this is the easiest thing, it's definitely not. But and the thing that kept coming up to me too is the shift in values, right? And how do we also create autonomy in our own lives while also staying integrated with our families and all of that, though? Like what, like you mentioning, like college not being for everybody, right? Like where are our values, where's our intention, and where do we create the space for ourselves and for our students to get clear on that, right? Like what is valuable to them, right? Like maybe not getting an A isn't the value that they need. Like maybe a C, like I may look at it and go, how come this person isn't trying hard enough? Like they're so good in class, blah, 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 but then they don't do X, Y, and Z. So now they're getting a C, but that's me projecting what I think they need and want. Maybe a C is completely fine for them because they're also navigating a bunch of other stuff. And this is part of that, right? So I don't know why I brought that up, but just thinking about like how we can create stressful scenarios because we're not allowing people to also be their own autonomous selves. Yes. I agree with that, Paul. And especially over these last few years, communication. And I think one of the things that I'm starting to think about is how do we create spaces where people feel safe to communicate what's happening, right? Because support them and um we can't accommodate for them if they're not communicating with us, right? And that also taking responsibility, right? That it's also not about just being like, I'm so stressed out, I can't do any of this. Like, we have to also learn how do we take responsibility for what's going on in our lives, so that, and accept certain things so that we can move forward, if that made sense. I'm very aware of time and we're over by a few minutes. So if you need to leave, I fully understand that. If there is anybody else who wants to share anything before we go, yeah. Tarun, am I saying your name correctly?
Yeah, Tarum. Thanks,
Tarun.
Stephanie. I've been reading this book, The Body Keeps the Score, about
Yes.
trauma. And so I was thinking a lot about it through this time. And so obviously, Mohammed, thank you for bringing it up. And what struck me so much was how, I don't know exactly understand the relationship between trauma and stress, but sort of how much overlap it seemed in terms of sort of like the embodiment of it, and that was something I very much took away, as well as different ways to try and disrupt these kind of automated kind of signals that have been kind of written over periods of time. And so I found that incredibly helpful. Thank you.
I lost. Hold on, my earphones went away. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yes, that's a great book. And I lost a little bit of the last part you had because my AirPods went away, but it's a great book. And we do, like when I started at the beginning saying that we hold all of this in our body, and so bringing ourselves back to the body, and that's what the breath practices are going to do. There's another thing, I took a trauma dance therapy somatic workshop a few months ago, and one of the breath exercises she had us do was putting our hand on our chest, and as we exhaled, slightly pressing into our chest with our hand, and then releasing, and then again. And what it's doing is it's activating the vagal system, right, and recalibrating all of that. And just so, like, what is touching doing? What's the sensations? How are we doing all of how are we creating more awareness and mindfulness around that, because that's really how we're going to shift everything else. Well, thank you, everybody. As we mentioned before, this will be going up on
TLC website, and you can come back to it anytime. I'll also we'll put the slides up somewhere too to have people reference those, and you can find me either through my own website, which is just stephanie-simpson.com, or also my John Jay email, which is stsimpson@johnj.cuny.edu. And we'll be doing some more things throughout the school year. So hopefully we'll see many of you again. Thank you.